This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm bringing you something a little bit different than my usual content. This channel recently turned 6 years old, and for most of those 6 years, my videos have been top 10 videos and videos that focus on the limited format, but I decided that today it was time to try something new, and I'm bringing you the pilot episode of a new series, one that will examine the history of various competitive decks throughout the entire history of Magic. In each video of this series, I'll examine when a particular kind of deck emerged, and then the various iterations of that deck over the years. In this first episode, as I'm sure you've gathered from the title and the thumbnail, I'm going to be talking about the history of Goblin decks. Goblins are near and dear to me because I first got interested in competitive Magic way back in Onslaught Block, and I played Goblins in Extended, so I thought it would be good to start this series with a look at Goblins. At one time or another, Goblins have been a major player in Block Constructed, Standard, Extended, Legacy, and Historic. In this video, we'll proceed chronologically from the beginning of Magic to the present day. Now, let's get started with a look at Goblin Prehistory. In other words, Goblins before they became a force on the competitive scene. Goblins are one of Magic's oldest, well-supported creature types, with Goblin King originally printed way back in Magic's very first set, Alpha, in 1993. Subsequent sets brought new tools for goblins. For example, in 1994, there was Goblin Caves in the Dark and Goblin Grenade in Fallen Empires. The caves could make your goblin's toughness higher, and Goblin Grenade allowed you to sacrifice a goblin for 5 damage, and you only had to pay 1 mana for it. In 1998, Urza's Saga featured Goblin Lackey and Goblin Matron. The Lackey let you put a goblin into play for free when it did combat damage to an opponent, and the Matron allowed you to tutor up any goblin. And in 2001, there was Drownu's Crusade in Planeshift and Goblin Ringleader in Apocalypse. The Crusade pumped all your goblins, and the Ringleader could draw you other goblins off the top of your deck. These aren't all the examples. There were lots of goblin payoffs starting from Magic's very beginning. However, while there were regularly new cards that made you want to play a bunch of goblins, a goblin deck that succeeded at Magic's highest level of competition didn't show up until 2002, after the release of Onslaught. Onslaught Block had a very strong tribal theme, and it heavily featured goblins as the red tribe. Goblin decks didn't make their first appearance in Standard, though. Instead, they first found success in Extended after the release of Onslaught, the first set in Onslaught Block. At Grand Prix Reims in 2002, both Benjamin Kaum and Patrick Mello piloted Goblin decks to top 8 finishes. While their decks were not identical, they did combine the brand new powerful goblins like Goblin Piledriver and Sparksmith with older goblin payoffs like the aforementioned Goblin Lackey. Goblin Piledriver could become massive on a board filled with goblins, while Sparksmith could clear just about any creature out of the way, and Goblin Lackey could flood the board with other goblins. The whole goal of the deck was, of course, to kill the opponent quickly with cheap aggressive creatures while taking advantage of goblin tribal synergies. So, with only 1/3 of Onslaught Block released, goblins were already making an impact in Extended with the help of some older goblins. Goblins would only get more powerful from here, as the remaining 2 sets of Onslaught Block, Legions, and Scourge would introduce even more powerful goblins. Let's talk about some of the most important cards among these new goblins. There was Goblin Warchief, which could reduce the cost of goblins and give them haste, effectively making your goblins capable of attacking a full 2 turns earlier than they would have otherwise been able to. There was also Gem Palm Incinerator, which was effectively a removal spell that drew you a card, and Skirk Prospector, which could let you give up goblins for mana. By 2003, Goblin decks had received enough of a power-up that decks built around them were finding success in Onslaught Block, Standard, Extended, and Legacy. These Goblin decks could end up with absolutely absurd starts. In Standard, turn 1 Skirk Prospector, turn 2 Goblin Warchief, and then turn 3 2 Goblin Piledrivers and some other goblin was not a rare sight. This was even more doable in Extended and Legacy, where Goblin Lackey could allow for absolutely crazy starts. In fact, Goblin Lackey ended up getting banned and Extended in September of 2003 because the deck was just too good with this powerful 1-drop. While Goblin decks in different formats certainly weren't identical, their game plan was pretty much the same and largely based around Goblin Warchief and Goblin Piledriver. One of the more interesting variants of these Goblin decks was piloted by Wolfgang Eder at Worlds in 2003. This variant, which he called Goblin Bidding, ran the powerful sorcery Patriarch's Bidding. One of the few weaknesses Goblins had was against board sweepers, and Wolfgang decided to splash black in the deck to have access to Patriarch's Bidding, which would immediately rebuild your board while also allowing you to attack right away if Goblin Warchief was among those creatures reanimated. It got a lot of extra mileage out of Goblins who could sacrifice themselves too, like Siege Gang Commander and Skirk Prospector, as you could take advantage of all those sacrifices and then just get them all back to attack anyway with Patriarch's Bidding. So, Goblin decks with an Onslaught Block core were really good, finding a lot of success in multiple formats, but the deck eventually rotated out of Standard and Extended. However, Goblins did continue to have a relevant presence in Legacy all the way through to 2015. Legacy Goblins were largely made up of mostly Urza's Block and Onslaught Block Goblins like those we've discussed, but there were a few other Goblins printed over the years that found their way into the deck, like Time Spiral's Mog War Marshal, which really helped you go wide with Goblins in a hurry. More Goblin payoffs were printed in the coming years, with Lorwyn Block featuring cards like Frog Tosser Banneret and Boggart Harbinger, but despite this, no Goblin deck emerged in Block or Standard. However, 2019's Modern Horizons has led to a Goblin deck emerging in Modern. Cards from Modern Horizons skip Standard entirely, but obviously enough they're legal in Modern, and that set featured a couple of strong new Goblins, with Sling Gang Lieutenant being the most notable one. It gives you 3 Goblin bodies that you can sacrifice to drain the opponent. In 2020, a new Black-Red Goblin deck emerged in Modern that sought to end games with Sling Gang Lieutenant. This deck also finally provided a home for the aforementioned Frog Tosser Banneret and Boggart Harbinger. These Goblin decks look to get as many Goblin tokens into play as possible so that the opponent can have their life rapidly drained. The deck also uses the newly printed Core Set 2021 card Conspicuous Snoop, which not only allows you to rip through your deck if Goblins are on top of your library, it also can gain the abilities of Goblins who are on top of your library if they're activated abilities. The main combo for the deck is to get Kiki Jiki on top of your library and then use the Snoop to make a copy of itself using Kiki Jiki's ability. You can then do this as many times as you want because each new copy can then make another copy until you get enough Goblins to drain your opponent to death with Sling Gang Lieutenant. And you can get this all done with just a Snoop and a Harbinger because the Harbinger lets you choose a Goblin to put on top of your library, and that's what the Snoop cares about. These new, combo-focused modern Goblin decks have yet to top 8 a Premier event, but it seems likely that it will happen at some point. There is one format, though, where Goblins have emerged as a major force within the last year, and that's Historic. Historic is an arena-only format. All the cards in Magic Arena are legal in it, except the banned ones. Because of the variety of cards that are available in Magic Arena, Historic Goblins features a lot of the same cards that older Goblin decks from other formats did, like Gem Palm Incinerator, Goblin Ringleader, Goblin Matron, Goblin Warchief, and Skirk Prospector. But there were 2 new cards that really powered Historic Goblins. One of them is Core Set 2021's Conspicuous Snoop, which we discussed a moment ago. It's the Goblin that lets you cast Goblins from the top of your library. And the other is Jumpstart's Muxus Goblin Grandee. Muxus might cost a lot more mana than your average Goblin, but Historic Goblins have enough ramp and cost reduction that playing Muxus is very realistic, and generally, if he comes down, you're just going to win. He lets you put all the Goblins in the top 6 cards of your library onto the battlefield, and if one of those is either Goblin Warchief or Goblin Chieftain, or you already have one of these haste-granting Goblins in play, your whole board will also have haste. And Muxus gets buffed for every attacking Goblin, so your attack that turn is going to be absolutely massive. Goblins continues to be a successful deck in Historic, and right now, it's the only competitive Goblin deck that we can say is successful, though as I noted, I think Modern Goblins is going to be making some noise in the near future. So, that's the history of Goblins, from Goblin King to Muxus Goblin Grandee. It is especially interesting to me that for all of the successful Goblin decks, cards originally printed in Onslaught Block are at their core, no matter what format we're talking about. Goblin Warchief especially seems to be crucial for Goblins to be successful. And that concludes the first episode of this new series. Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments and with the like and dislike buttons. Your feedback is much appreciated. This is a pilot episode, and whether or not I do more of these is largely dependent on viewer response. Also, let me know what deck archetypes you'd like to see in the future in this series. Thanks for watching.